meeting is being recorded.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Parshas Toldos. And tonight is also Rosh Chodesh, of course, and tomorrow is Thanksgiving. So a lot of stuff going on tomorrow. Okay. I wanted to talk about an issue. Well, I'll tell you what the issue is. Last week we discussed how old Rivka was when she got married. Was she 3? Was she 14? Right. So that was a little bit of a wild topic, and I got some good feedback about that. So I wanted a wild topic for this week also. And I don't know if I got as wild a topic, but it's kind of wild. We'll see. There's a lot of interesting discussion here. All right. The issue basically is, was Yitzchak wealthy? Okay. Now we'll see why that's important for certain parts of the story. But when we read the Torah, right, if you've been reading these stories for a while, so our general assumption is that Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, each of the Avos, were very wealthy, right? And that's the sense that you always get from reading the stories, because there's always, there's a lot of, animals, right? There's a lot of property. There's a lot of slaves. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of they have these big operations that they're running, right? There seems to be a lot of wealth that Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov have. I mean, with Yitzchak, we have all these stories that we're going to read about this week. About how he gets into fights with the Plishtim because he's too wealthy, right? The general impression that we always get is that the Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were wealthy. But as we're going to see, there's a very interesting argument to be made that Yitzchak, at least at some point in his life, was not well off, and he was in fact poor. Okay, so we're going to see. I want to go through that argument. And we'll see how that affects different parts of the story. All right. So, and there's also a theological component to this also. All right. So I think there'll be a lot of interesting information over here. Let me start with the Ibn Ezra. All right. He has a very interesting discussion about this. And what he's trying to explain is the following. The Torah says that Esav despised the Bechorah, right? He looked down on the Bechorah on being the Bechor. All right, so wait 1 second. Okay. So the Torah says, right, Esav sells his birthright, his firstbornness, right? He sells it to Yaakov, and the Torah comments, "Vayivaz Esav es habechora," that Esav despised being the firstborn. Okay, now, what does this mean, right? Why did he despise being the firstborn? So the Ibn Ezra comments like this, that what does it mean to be the firstborn? It means to get a double portion, right? That's how the Torah defines a firstborn. And not defines it, but that's one of the rules of a firstborn, that the rest of the brothers get one portion each, and the firstborn gets a double portion. So why would Esav despise inheriting a double portion of property from his father? So the Ibn Ezra says a somewhat surprising answer. He says that Yitzchak was very poor. Okay, Yitzchak did not have a lot of wealth. There was nothing really to inherit. So Esav didn't care to inherit a double portion because there was so little to begin with that it was irrelevant whether he was going to get a double portion or a single portion. So that's what the Torah means, that Esav despised the firstborn. Not that he despised the concept of being a firstborn, but he despised being the firstborn of his own father, Yitzchak, because Yitzchak was not wealthy. There wasn't much to inherit, so it didn't matter whether he got a double portion. Okay, so the Ibn Ezra says, well, you're going to ask me, Avraham was very wealthy. So why was Yitzchak poor, right? If his father was very wealthy, why didn't he inherit the money from his father, Avraham? So the Ibn Ezra says, the Ibn Ezra is a very sharp writer. He says, have you never seen a child lose their parents' money, right? This happens all the time. Someone is wealthy and their child loses the money, however they do it, right? Whatever it is, this is the way of the world. So even though Abraham was wealthy, Yitzchak lost the money and he was poor. And that's why Esav didn't care to get a double portion of the Bechorah, and he sold it to Yaakov because it wasn't worth anything. Okay. Now the Ibn Ezra goes on and he has 4 arguments, 4 proofs, actually 5 proofs. 5 proofs that Yitzchak was poor. Okay, and some of these are things that you probably never thought about before. This is a very creative idea that he has. But the Ibn Ezra says that there are 5 proofs in the Torah that Yitzchak was was not wealthy. He was poor. Number one is that the Torah says that Yitzchak loved Esav because Esav brought him food, right? Hitzayid befiv, that Esav used to bring his father Yitzchak food. So the Ibn Ezra says if Yitzchak was a wealthy man, right, and he had normal food in his house, he had a well-stocked pantry, what does he care if his son brings him food, right? Why did he care that Esav used to bring him food? So the answer is that Yitzchak was poor. He didn't have a lot of food at home. So that's why he was happy. He appreciated that Esav brought him food. And that's why that's why he loved Esav, because he used to give him food, because Yitzchak was a poor man. He didn't have food to eat. Okay, number two, says the Ibn Ezra, Esav sells his birthright. What does he sell it for? He sells it for some lentil soup. So again, if this was a well-stocked home, why is Esav selling the birthright for lentil soup, right? It sounds like there was no food in the house. So there's only this lentil soup, so Esav is desperate to get his hands on it. Number three also has to do with food. The first three proofs all have to do with food. Number three is that Yitzchak says to Esav, go hunt and bring me a meal. Now, if you're someone who's eating every day, right, what are you making a big deal that today you're going to get a meal? So it sounds like Yitzchak normally did not get a meal, right? There wasn't food in the house really. So that's why it was a special occasion. And he says to Esav, go hunt and bring me food. Meaning on a non-special occasion, he didn't really have food to eat. Okay, so the Ibn Ezra basically has three proofs right now that have to do with food, that Yitzchak did not really have food at home. In general, they went hungry, right? One of them is because Yitzchak loved Esav because he brought him food. Number two is that Esav sells the Bechorah for lentil soup. And number three is that that Yitzchak asked Esav to bring him a meal because it was a special occasion. So again, this all gives the impression of a home without much food in it, meaning they were poor. Okay, proof number four, he says, is that what does Rivka say when Yaakov steals the blessings, right? So Rivka tells him, go get Esav's like special coat that he used to wear. So it sounds like Esav had a special coat, but Yaakov didn't, right? Because otherwise, in other words, Yitzchak was going to feel the coat, and when he felt the coat, he would know that it was Esav. So how would he know? Maybe it's Yaakov's coat. So it sounds like Esav had a coat, but Yaakov didn't. So again, this gives the impression of poverty, that Yaakov grew up not having a coat, right? He wasn't able to get a second coat. Okay, and the fifth argument that he has is that when Yaakov runs away from home, right? So Esav gets mad. He says, I'm going to kill Yaakov, my brother. So Yaakov runs away from home. So one of the things that Yaakov says on his way, he says to God, if you give me food and water, bread and water. So it sounds like he didn't even have bread and water. So again, why did Yaakov leave home, right? Why did he run from home without taking some provisions for the road, right? He leaves empty-handed. So this again gives the impression that this was a poor home. There was not much food in the house. So Yaakov was not able to grab anything on his way out. All right, that is the Ibn Ezra's 5 arguments. Okay, so again, so right now what we've seen is 2 things in the Ibn Ezra. Okay, which is number 1, the Ibn Ezra explains that the reason why Esav didn't care to be the Bechor is because there wasn't much. Yitzchak was a poor man, so it didn't matter to get a double portion. And then he has 5 arguments from the Torah, 5 pieces of evidence that indicate that this was a poor home. Now, the issue is that the Torah explicitly says, Vayigdal ha'ish, right? It's clear that Yitzchak was very wealthy when he had a fight with the Plishtim. The Torah says that he was so wealthy and they bothered him, right? He had all these wells. I mean, it's clear that he was a wealthy man. So the Ibn Ezra says that's not a problem. He was poor when he was younger, right? The story of Esav selling the birthright happened when they were younger. And then in his older years, Yitzchak got wealthy. Okay, so when he was a younger man, he was poor, and then later he made money, and that's what the Torah is talking about. Okay, so this is the Ibn Ezra's argument. Now he says something which is very, very fascinating from a theological point of view. Okay, and he says that Ivrei Leiv, okay, people who are blind-hearted. Okay, again, he's a very sharp writer. He says that people who are blind-hearted say that it's good for righteous people, for tzaddikim, to be wealthy. Okay, so there's a movement in America today. There's a Christian movement that if you're really pious, then God will make you wealthy. right? That's one of their that's like I forget what they call it, the gospel of wealth or something. Okay, so there's people who say the Ibn Ezra quotes that there's people who say that that it's good for righteous people, for tzaddikim to be wealthy. So the Ibn Ezra says that's ridiculous, and the proof is that Eliyahu Hanavi, right? Eliyahu, one of the greatest prophets of all time, was dirt poor. He had to run from his house. He literally had no food. He had nothing. He was dirt poor. So you see that even someone who's incredibly righteous might be poor, right? There's no proof. There's no concept that God gives money, gives wealth to righteous people. So the same thing is true of Yitzchak, that even though he was an incredibly righteous man, he was a poor man, and that's there's no problem for that. Says the Ibn Ezra, there's people who ask, it's the same basic thing, but people press the question, right? Why would God punish Yitzchak by making him poor, right? Why did he deserve to be poor? Says the Ibn Ezra, this is a ridiculous question, because why did God make Yitzchak blind, right? We read in our parsha that Yitzchak was blind when he was older. So why did God make him blind? So the Ibn Ezra says we can't explain what God does. Only God knows the secret, the mystery of the world. We can't explain why he makes the decisions he does. And why Yitzchak was blind, why Yitzchak was poor is not our business to understand. That's beyond us. We just accept that God has a plan and God knows what he's doing. Okay, so that is the Ibn Ezra's view of this issue. So now, this is just a fascinating theological point, right? According to the Ibn Ezra, this gospel of wealth business, right? This idea that people who are righteous are going to necessarily be rich, that God's going to reward them with earthly wealth, is totally wrong. Okay, it's not proven by the Torah. It's not proven by logic, right? It's not our experience of the world. And there's no reason to think that. So it's possible that Yitzchak was a very righteous man like Eliyahu, and he was still blind, he was still poor, and only God knows how he makes the decisions that he does. Okay, now what I want to turn to now is the Ramban. Okay, the Ramban has a long disagreement with the Ibn Ezra about this, and he is going to disagree with each point of the Ibn Ezra, and very interestingly, he's going to disagree also with the theological view of it. Okay, so this is a very interesting debate. Both in terms of understanding the Torah, and in terms of understanding Yitzchak's life, as well as understanding this idea, does God reward righteous people with wealth or not? Okay, so I want to go through the Ramban, and I'm going to also try to show that Rashi, even though he never addresses this issue head on, but he also seems to agree with the Ramban on this issue. All right, so we'll as we go through it, we'll see how this works. Okay, so first of all, the Ramban says that it's very, very hard to say that Yitzchak was a poor man. Okay, because he has two major questions on this view. First of all, according to the Ibn Ezra, right, as I said, Yitzchak was poor when he was younger, but then he was wealthy when he was older. So says the Ramban, this is totally ridiculous, right? What do you need to say? According to this whole view, what you're going to need to say is that Yitzchak inherited a lot of money from his father. Then he lost the money, right? That's when the whole story of Esav and Yaakov, of Esav selling the Chorah, right? That's when it happened because they were poor at that point. Then he became wealthy again, right? Because the Torah says that he got wealthy. Even the Ibn Ezra agrees with that. And then he lost the money again, right? So that when Yaakov took the blessings, they were poor again. Right, so this doesn't make any sense. I mean, come on, right? This sort of defies logic that he was wealthy when he inherited the money, then he got poor, then he got wealthy, then he got poor. I mean, it's like ridiculous, right? How many times does one guy lose his wealth? Okay, so that's the Ramban's first question. But then he says that the Torah uses the phrase "Vayivarech Elokim es Yitzchak," that God blessed Yitzchak. Now, the word bracha always means more. So it means that God gave Yitzchak more wealth than Abraham had. Okay, so how could you say that Yitzchak lost the wealth that he inherited from Abraham when the Torah says that he increased the wealth? Okay, so the Ramban says that you cannot argue this idea that Yitzchak was poor, and then he disagrees with the whole theology of the Ibn Ezra, and he says that you cannot say that God doesn't give righteous people wealth. Okay, the Ramban disagrees, and he says that God does give tzaddikim wealth, and this is based on a pasuk. That the pasuk says, "Birkas Hashem hi ta'ashir," that the blessing of Hashem makes people wealthy. Okay, so according to the Ramban, it's not true what the Ibn Ezra is saying, that God doesn't give tzaddikim wealth. He does give them, and it can't be that Yitzchak was not blessed with wealth. Okay, and the Ramban says that all of the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, each of them were like kings back in the day. All right, in other words, we think of them as our spiritual ancestors, which they are, but they were also very powerful worldly men. They had a lot of property. They had large, large estates, right? They were very well-to-do people. And they basically functioned like a king back in the day. A lot of the kings had small little countries, or small little nations. So they were like kings back in the day, but they were very powerful people. Right? You cannot say that they were poor people. Now, what about this issue that Yaakov became, that Yitzchak became blind, right? Because that was one of the Ibn Ezra's arguments. If you're going to tell me that righteous people have such easy lives, then why did Yitzchak become blind? So the Ramban says that's not a good question. All right, he calls anyone that asks that blind-hearted. So now they're all just calling each other blind-hearted. All right, but he says that that's a bad question because God specifically made Yitzchak blind so that Yaakov could steal the blessings. Right? In other words, if Yitzchak was able to see, then Yaakov would never have had a chance to steal the blessings. So that's why God specifically made Yitzchak blind, even though he didn't deserve it, so that Yaakov would have a chance to steal the blessings. Also, the Ramban says that was just the way it happened in the olden days, right? Even nowadays, it happens a lot, but we have glasses. But in the olden days, when they didn't have glasses, so people got blind. They got hard of seeing when they got older, right? In other words, that was just the normal way. He quotes that Yaakov got blind when he was older. Achia Shiloni, one of the prophets, got blind when he was older, right? The Torah says that it was a miracle that Moshe didn't get blind when he was older. So you see that this was just the natural way that people got blind when they were older. But you can't ask, why did Yitzchak get blind when he was older? That's just the natural way. All right. Or the other option is that God specifically did it in order for Yaakov to be able to take the blessings. All right. Now, Rashi also, and again, we'll get to Rashi in a minute, but like I said, Rashi also indicates that he basically agrees with the Ramban in this whole dispute. Okay. And Rashi also gives a number of reasons why Yitzchak became blind. All right. So this is the first point that I just want to make. It's a very fascinating point, okay, that there's a debate between the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra, two of our greatest commentators, whether or not, again, like I said, right, there's a lot of Christians, there's a whole movement that believes that wealth comes along with piety, okay, and this is a debate, all right, according to the Ramban, they're correct. According to the Ibn Ezra, they are not correct by any stretch, all right, so this is a very, very interesting theological debate in terms of the relationship of wealth and piety. Okay, now let me go to the next issue. Okay, because like we saw, the Ibn Ezra said that Esav despised the Bechorah because Yitzchak was poor, so there was nothing to inherit really. So according to the Ramban, that Yitzchak was wealthy, so why did Esav despise the Bechorah, right? Why didn't he want the double portion? So the Ramban says that before the Torah was given, right? In other words, who said that the Bechor gets a double portion, that the firstborn gets a double portion? So the Ramban says that the Torah introduced that law. But who says that before the Torah, the firstborns were getting a double portion, right? There's no proof that we don't have any sources that early in Jewish history, before the Torah was given, there was a double portion for the firstborn. So the Ramban says that it doesn't make sense that maybe, right, it's very plausible that there was no double portion in the times of Abraham and Yitzchak. So what did it mean to be a Bechor? It was a certain issue of status, right? The Bechor had a certain status in the family that was like almost like a father, right? He was like the second in command of the family. So that was the importance of being the firstborn. It wasn't financial at all, right? It had nothing to do with financial. Or the Ramban says maybe the Bechor would get a little more, right? But not double. He would just get like a little bit more than everybody else. But either way, it could be that being a Bechor had nothing to do with financial stuff. It was just a matter of your status in the family. So that's why Esav didn't care about being a Bechor, because he didn't care about his status, right? He didn't want to be a leader of the family. He just wanted to do his hunting and to do his wild stuff. But he didn't want to take care of the family the way a Bechor would have to. Okay, so according to the Ramban, that's why Esav was disinterested in the Bechor. It has nothing to do with money, all right, even though Yitzchak was wealthy. But if the Bechor had been a double portion, then Esav would have wanted it. but because because there was a lot of wealth there. But because the Bechor meant something totally different, so that's why Esav wasn't interested, and that's why he sold it. Now, let me just note that Rashi agrees. All right, Rashi has a similar understanding to the Ramban, that being a Bechor in the olden days had nothing to do with money. Okay, according to Rashi, it meant the ability to sacrifice, to bring the sacrifices for God. Okay, so the Bechor was like a Kohen back in the day. All right, we know that before the Kohanim, the firstborns were the ones that did the service of the sacrifices. So that's according to Rashi what they were arguing about, who was going to do the service. Okay, so according to the Ibn Ezra, they were arguing about money, or let's say Yaakov was taking the money. According to the Ramban, Yaakov was taking the status. And according to Rashi, he was taking the ability to serve, to do the sacrificial services. Okay, now let's turn to the Ibn Ezra's proofs, right? Because the Ibn Ezra had a few proofs about that indicated that Yitzchak was poor. So the Ramban goes step by step through all of his proofs. Okay, number one is the Ibn Ezra said why, right? Yitzchak loved Esav because he used to bring him food. So that sounds like Yitzchak didn't have a well-stocked pantry, right? He wasn't a wealthy man. He didn't have food, if not that his son brought it. So the Ramban says, no. That has nothing to do with it. The reason why Yitzchak appreciated Esav's food that he brought him is because it's like a gift, right? In other words, even nowadays, right? You bring a gift even to someone who's incredibly wealthy. It's a way of showing a certain friendship or a certain relationship, right? It's not about the money, right? You could bring a gift to someone that has tons of money, but it's the gift that matters. So in the same way, Esav would bring his father gifts. It wasn't about the financial value of it. It was because his son was bringing him gifts, so he appreciated it, right? The Ramban has a very cute line. He says that it's easy for a father to love his firstborn, right? In other words, it's not like Yitzchak needed a lot, right? A father naturally wants to love his firstborn, so it's not like Yitzchak needed a lot of pushing in order to love his firstborn. So when Esav would bring him these gifts, he appreciated it. Okay, now why did Yitzchak tell Esav to bring a meal on the day he was blessing him? Right? It sounds like this was a special occasion, so they needed to have a meal. Right? It sounds like they didn't have meals on normal days. So again, says the Ramban, no. This wasn't about the food. It's not about the food. It wasn't that he needed the actual food. But what Yitzchak was saying to Esav is, bring me the food so that I feel close to you and I want to bless you. Right? In other words, today is the day that he's blessing his son, so he wants to feel that special, even more close to him than usual. So he said, bring me food so that I can so that I'll feel good. I'll feel even closer to you, and I'll want to bless you. Okay, so again, the Ramban is rereading all of these little facts, all of these little stories. It has nothing to do with food. It has nothing to do with the money. It has to do with the relationship between the father and the son. Then the Ramban adds in something very interesting. He has another suggestion. Right, this is a very interesting idea. Right, we know that in order for prophets to receive prophecy, they needed to be in a good mood. They needed to be happy. You couldn't get a prophecy if you were depressed. So the Ramban says that's why Yitzchak needed an extra good meal that day, not because he didn't have food. He had plenty of food in his house, but he wanted to be in an extra good mood so that he would have like a prophetic spirit while he was blessing his son. All right, so this is a very interesting idea. First of all, it's interesting, right? This is something we know, but you don't think about it in Yitzchak so much. But right, eating a good meal puts you in a good mood, right? So even that was true 4,000, 5,000 years ago, as much as it is nowadays, right? Eating a good meal, makes you happy. So Yitzchak wanted a good meal so that he would be happy and that he would have prophecy. It also shows you how serious this business was. This was not just a blessing that he was throwing out, but it needed a certain prophetic element to it. All right, so it's a very interesting discussion. Okay, now what about the clothing, right? It sounds like in the Torah, like only Esav had a coat. Yaakov didn't have a coat. So again, that seems to be like they were, too poor to buy a coat. So the Ramban says, no, maybe Yaakov also had a coat. But the whole point was to fool Yitzchak into thinking that this was Esav. So that's why they wanted to use Esav's coat so that Yitzchak would feel him and he would feel like it was Esav. So there's no proof from this story that Yaakov didn't have a coat. Now, what's interesting is that Rashi quotes a medrash, he quotes a tradition that this coat was very special. This was the coat that Esav had stolen from the king Nimrod. right? Nimrod was one of the great kings back in the day. He tried to kill Avram, right? He was back in the day one of the big kings. So Esav had his coat. So that's why it was a special coat. So again, right, I told you earlier, Rashi seems to read a lot of these stories like the Ramban, that Yitzchak was wealthy, right? You would never pick this up if you just read Rashi's commentary, because he never talks about it explicitly. But a lot of the stories that seem to imply that maybe Yitzchak had a poor house, Rashi rereads them in a way that changes the meaning of the story. So it's very clever the way Rashi does it. Okay, so again, according to Rashi, it's not saying that Esav could afford a coat and Yaakov couldn't afford a coat. They both had coats to keep them warm, but Esav had this special coat that belonged to King Nimrod. All right, so that's why it was a special coat, and that's why Yaakov put it on to fool his father. Okay, and the last issue that we'll deal with is that why didn't Yaakov take any food or provisions or money with him when he ran from home? Right. So after his brother threatened to kill him, he ran from home, and he says he doesn't even have bread and water. So why not? Right. Why didn't he take anything with him? So the Ibn Ezra said it's because they were poor. The Ramban says, nah, it has nothing to do with that. They were rich. They had plenty of food and money. But Yaakov was running, right? He's on the run. He couldn't take stuff with him. He had to run. He had to go as fast as possible. He couldn't wait around. And imagine he's lugging all sorts of stuff with him, right? There would have been bandits on the road that would have robbed him, that would have gone after him. He would have been a sitting duck if he had all this wealth and money on him traveling back in the olden days, right? And Esav would have been even more angry. Imagine Esav realized that not only did he escape, but he also took a lot of money with him. So he would have been even more angry. So it had nothing to do with Yitzchak's wealth. It was just, it made no sense for Yaakov to try to take stuff with him. So he just left and he didn't take anything with him. Now, Rashi also has a similar idea. Rashi quotes a story that Eliphaz, all right, who was Esav's son, actually caught up with Yaakov, and his father Esav sent him to kill Yaakov. But Eliphaz had grown up in the house of Yitzchak, so he said, "I'm not going to kill you, Yaakov." Right? He was too good a guy to kill Yaakov. So instead, he just took all his money and left Yaakov penniless. Okay, but he didn't kill him. So according to Rashi, Yaakov did leave with a lot of money and a lot of stuff, but Eliphaz robbed him on the way. His nephew robbed him on the way and took the stuff from him. Okay, so again, like I said, Rashi seems to read a lot of these stories like the Ramban, that Yitzchak was a wealthy home, just like his father Abraham. And there's explanations in each of these stories for why things went the way they did, different than the Ibn Ezra. All right, so this is basically the debate between the Ibn Ezra and the Ramban, a very fascinating debate. Was Yitzchak rich like his father and like his son, or were there times in his life when he was poor? And again, we've seen that there's some evidence to indicate he was poor, but there's also some counter arguments. So you could read these different ways. All right, we've seen the issue of why Esav didn't want to be a Bechor. It depends on this whole issue, right? If his father was poor, then that's the explanation. But if his father was rich, then we need to explain the whole issue of the firstbornship differently. All right, so that's also that comes out of this whole issue. And then, like I said, I think this is a fascinating theological debate between two of our top commentators, whether people who are righteous, God blesses them with wealth or not. All right, so it's a very, very interesting issue. All right, let me stop this.